Well, God bless you all on today. Grateful for another clergy conversation. I'm grateful for my special guest on today. He is the proud pastor of the Mount Zion Baptist Church in Austin, Texas. Great preacher, great scholar. This pastor is. If you have not heard him, I encourage you to listen to him because you will not be disappointed. The proud pastor of the Mount Zion Baptist Church, Reverend Dr. Daryl Horton. Pastor, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pastor Brown, thank you so much. The honor is mine. Just grateful to have the opportunity to chat it up with you today.
Man, I appreciate it. So let's just jump right in. Just tell us a little bit about your background. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So like you said, I'm in the city of Austin. I'm a native Austinite. Been here my whole life, traveled just a little bit with my wife while she was active duty military, but for the most part, been in Austin for all of my life. I have the privilege of serving the Mount Zion Baptist Church here in Austin, the privilege and the honor to succeed the Reverend Dr. G.V. Clark after he led us for over 51 years here at the Mount Zion Church. And so just excited about that. It's just my wife and I, and she's a nurse. And so she teaches nursing at the University of Texas here in Austin. And so we are just excited about what God is doing in the city of Austin and all the ministry privileges that we're allowed to have.
So you're a Longhorn?
No, not necessarily. Live down the street, root for them time to time, but we actually met at TCU, so we're horn frogs. That's where the blood flows purple. But my wife, since she teaches there and she did get a couple of her degrees from there, we're kind of a mixed family a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. So when you are, matriculating and growing up in church, what was for you? What were just things that I guess motivated you, or how did you come to Christ?
Great question. So when I grew up, I was one of those kids that actually grew up in church. It's hard for me to remember a time in my childhood when I was not in church. So I definitely credit my parents and my family for my Christian upbringing. Like most kids, I grew up as an usher. I grew up in the choir, doing all of those kind of things, a junior deacon in the church and all of that. But I think my Christian faith was really solidified even after high school and all of that. I knew what it was to know about God and to do those things, but I don't think I really became an active Christian or a disciple until I went off to college and had some encounters and met some new people, and the Lord really just began speaking into my life from there. So it's, like everybody else, I had one of those moments where I was like, are you going to do this for real, or are you going to keep playing with God? Which one?
So how old were you when you first either felt the call to preach, or when you first started preaching? What was your preaching journey? What was your journey into the preaching ministry?
Great question. So I went off to school, as I mentioned, at TCU, and I was active in church doing a lot of things, but it really wasn't until I came back home after an unsuccessful stint of education at TCU. I had to come back home to try to get my mind together and be ready for school. And so when I returned home, it was really interesting that while I was, I guess most people would say, trying to find themselves, I was really hearing the voice of God. And it was really just one day, I'll never forget, I used to sit at home and listen to Charles Stanley and Chuck Swindoll on the radio with my mom. And one day we were listening to a sermon, and I felt the Lord just really talk to me and say, I'm calling you to do more. I'm calling you to do more. And so I'm trying to figure out what that means and what that is. And so over time, I just kind of discerned it over a couple of months, made a meeting with my pastor at the time. And I said, hey, I'm struggling with something. I'm hoping you can help me. And the way God would do it is that I'll never forget Pastor Brown. I met him one night for dinner. And when I walked into the room, he said, I've been waiting a long time for you. And so I looked at my watch and I was like, but I'm not that late. What are you talking about? And he says, I'm not talking about tonight. He says, I've seen this call on your life since I've been pastoring the church, and I've been waiting on you, hoping that you would finally see it. And so when I officially announced my call, I was 22 years old.
And now, who was your pastor when you first started preaching?
Yeah, so I was actually at the First Baptist Church here in Austin, and my pastor at the time was Reverend Carl Harvey. And so he was serving actually as our interim pastor as the church was going through transition.
Yes, sir. So what was your first sermon?
Oh, my goodness. So I came before the church in December of whatever that was, 1995 or four, I guess that was. Told him I accepted the call to preach, and then I preached my first sermon that March of '95. And my first sermon was "Come on out on the water," talking about Peter taking the steps out of the boat. Yeah, it's on yes, man. I still laugh at it today. It was, nothing, nothing to be proud of, but God let me get through it.
I think, but that's funny. I think we all had that experience, that first sermon where it's like, what was I talking about? What was I
Oh
thinking?
gosh, yeah.
And so when you're in Austin, when you are first starting out in ministry and of course growing, but who are some of those strong like preaching voices, preaching role models that you looked up to that helped you along the process?
Wow, that is a great question. Great question. So, of course, Pastor Carl Harvey, as I mentioned to him, he was integral in my not just accepting the call, but the wisdom and the knowledge that he would give was always something spectacular. Believe it or not, one of the pastors that I think is well known is I remember hearing a lot of sermons from Pastor Delvin Atchison.
Oh
He
yes, oh
was
yes.
hanging around Austin a little bit at the time, and he would come in and doing things with our district association and state convention and stuff. So I can remember some of those early days of listening to him. Of course, Dr. Clark has been a staple in the Austin area for, I mean, 70 years at least. And so I can remember a lot of sermons from him. But, again, back then, it's a little different from now. Of course, as you would know, that is that we didn't have the YouTube and didn't have all that other stuff to hear people. So you basically had to hear people in person. And so Pastor A.W. Mays at Mount Sinai has always been a staple in this area since I've been preaching. And so we had a lot of good preachers that we could listen to. Pastor Griffin was at the Ebenezer Church. And so, yeah, there were so many that we could get a chance to sit under and listen to that have poured into our ministry for sure.
Well, it's funny those names you mentioned because love Uncle Dale, definitely love him.
Yeah.
But Dr. Clark, which we will get into, but
Sure.
also Pop Mays.
Oh, yeah.
Oh man, I listen. Reverend Dr. A.W.A. Mays, Pop Mays is one of the greatest preachers, greatest minds
Yes.
ever. And I told him when I was still serving Oklahoma, because I started hearing him when he used to come to Mount Olive Baptist Church in Arlington, Texas, when I was still
Yeah.
living there.
Yeah.
And then when I was serving in Oklahoma, my home state, before I moved up here to Kentucky, I was fortunate enough to get him, and he was fortunate enough to come. And of course, Pop Mays is an humble guy. But I told him something that inspired me, because I said, every time I've heard you, you've never re-preached something, but you're always fresh every time I heard you. And I asked him, how do you do that? And he gave me some insight, but just his mind, just the way his thought process goes, just so he's always been an encourager for me in how I wanted to grow as a preacher.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's been something that's been amazing here in Austin, is again to be around all of these type of preachers who do bring a freshness and a uniqueness to what ministry looks like. And so again, you look at people like Dr. Clark and Dr. Mays, you look at people like Reverend MC Walker, who has been here at the East 19th Street for several years and for decades. And so again, the Marvin Griffins and those who have just laid a legacy here in Austin, to hear about that preaching. And so, yeah, Austin is a hotbed for preachers, especially, from decades ago, to be able to hear some of these great men. Yeah.
And if you haven't been to Austin, they church in Austin. Let me just tell y'all that. They church down there in Austin, Texas. I'm just saying, they church from Waco, Austin, San Antonio. They church down there. So if you ain't been down there, I would encourage you, go to some citywide revivals and stuff, and you will see some churching going on in that part of the country.
That is true. Oh yeah.
And so, as you are starting out in ministry, starting out preaching, what were you getting a lot of preaching assignments? What were you doing in your time to, and says, grow your craft, grow your gift?
Great question. So again, I was at First Baptist Church when I first announced my call, and I did get some preaching opportunities. Most of them would be like on a Wednesday night when the pastor would not necessarily preach all of those sermons, and so that would be at home. Being a young man at the time, the churches in Austin and the surrounding area would be somewhat generous, and so people have youth anniversaries and youth services and things like that. And so they would allow us to come and to do those moments. But I spent a lot of time, I think what was most meaningful for me was spending a lot of time sitting and listening and watching.
Mhm.
Of course, you don't become a better preacher unless you have the opportunity to do more preaching. But early in my years, I did not have a lot of invitations. Most of it was either in-house or an occasional, invitation to go out somewhere else. But I spent most of my time in Sunday school, in Baptist Training Union, and teaching class and doing stuff like that.
So then, Pastor, what would you tell What would you tell a young preacher or young preachers who who are going, they're in ministry, they
Yeah.
want to preach, but they're not necessarily getting the preaching assignments. And for some, because I know how I felt, it was discouraging. For sometimes it can be discouraging, it can be frustrating, it can make them feel like, should I do this or shouldn't I do this? What advice would you give the younger preachers about when you're not getting necessarily those assignments, how to still stay committed?
Yeah, I like that question. So, and it is a struggle for all of us. I can definitely remember getting into a place at some point as I've been preaching for a number of years, and that hunger comes.
Yes.
You're just like, all I want to do is have an opportunity to preach. Why won't they let me preach? And again, we may talk about that later, but all those demons that come in the midst of you trying to do that. But the advice that I would give is, number one, I would tell any young preacher that the best thing you can do is to remain faithful to your pastor.
Yes, sir.
Always be willing to sit under your pastor, to listen, to watch, to observe, because I will tell you that in the 20 years I had the privilege to sit under Dr. Clark, I don't think any moment I was in his presence was wasted. Whether it was in the office, in the pulpit, whether it was at a convention or whatever it was, I made sure that I was watching and listening to how he operated, how he functioned, how he did those things. The second thing that I would tell a young preacher is that there are so many other opportunities to preach other than Sunday morning in the pulpit. If your church has a nursing home ministry, if your church has a street ministry, if your church has a children's ministry, Sunday school, any of those moments where you teach or get a chance to go outside and to do that preaching, all of that stuff develops who you are and helps you to develop who you are uniquely in your preaching. I can't tell you how encouraging and how formidable teaching Sunday school has been. I can't even tell you how long I've been teaching Sunday school. It's been so long. But teaching those Sunday school lessons, it helps you to prepare the lesson. It helps you to learn how to exegete the text. It teaches you how to be able to do things in a disciplined fashion. Because again, Sunday school, you only have so much time and you have to be able to get the lesson and break it down and do all of that. So I would encourage any of them to use those opportunities that are available to you and to make sure that you are always studying. I think many of us as preachers, the mistake we make is that we don't study until we get an invitation. And
Mm.
we ought to have personal study, personal discipline, personal time with God. And you would be amazed at the sermons and the content that come from studying without an invitation, studying for your own good. And that's what keeps you sharp and keeps you in the place so that when you do get the opportunity, you're more than ready.
And I want to go back to something you said about the demons.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I think that's very true. Talk about the demons.
Yeah. So some of the things that I've seen over the years is, as young preachers, we are excited, we're enthusiastic. And as you laughed, and we were laughing before, when you preach your first sermon, none of us knows what we're doing. We're up there just imitating what we know and trying to put something together. And so what happens is that I think there are so many different influences that we have, and some of them we don't ever want to name, because some of them end up being jealousy. Well, why does the pastor use so and so, and why does the pastor let them preach and let them do whatever? And so if you're not standing, you have to be careful that you don't allow that to infiltrate you and to begin to turn you into a place where you don't want to be. The second thing I've seen other preachers have, which is detrimental to your ministry, is that the enemy seeps into our head and says, well, the reason why the pastor won't let you preach is because he's afraid of you, because you preach better than him and the people want to hear him and all of that kind of nonsense. And so you have to be careful not to allow that type of stuff to get into your head and to cause friction between you and your pastor, or your friction between, because most of us have to understand that the way you treat your pastor, other pastors notice that.
Yes, sir.
And they recognize that and they talk. And if you have a terrible relationship with your pastor, there are other pastors in the city who are not going to respect you and allow you the opportunity to do any of those things. So you have to be careful about that kind of stuff. And then you talked about what I would suggest is that issue of discouragement, is that we have to understand that being called to be a preacher is more than standing in the pulpit. Being a preacher is a lifestyle. It is being disciplined. It is being a disciple everywhere we go. That there is my life is preaching every time I go to the store, every time I go wherever I go. And so it's more than just standing in front of people for the adoration and for the applause and for those type of things. And so those are kind of those demons I think about that I've seen over the years. And it's not just for those who are chronologically young. I have seen episodes where older preachers get to a place, especially if they have never had the opportunity to pastor a church, they believe that the clock is ticking and they begin to get desperate and they begin to look for things. And so I think throughout our ministry, there are a lot of those things we have to be careful about.
Yes, sir. And I love the way you explain that. Very encouraging. I remember a time when I was serving under Pastor Larry Mouton, as I call him.
Yeah.
As I call him Uncle LJ. But and sometimes members would come to me and say, why did he because all the other associates got to preach, and they were asked, why didn't he let you preach? And I would just say, that's his decision. It's not my decision. But he was teaching. I learned more under him by not preaching, because he taught me things about being creative, taught me things about, make sure this is sharp, but also taught me things about, how to lead a church through a building project and things like that. It was other things behind the scenes that people didn't know that he was teaching me, because I was always picking his brain. And I think what you said is also important, is that we have to be careful of not allowing the outside noise poison our spirit, because then you become it's like you become an enemy instead of becoming that son, that student, because all of us as Timothys, we need a Paul.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And again, that's a dangerous place to be, because also our heads begin to get inflated.
Yes, sir.
Because I try to help teach, some of the preachers now that when you preach that sermon, it's wonderful that the people come to you and tell you how it helped them, how you were moved, and how much they excited, all those other things that the membership tell us. But don't allow that to inflate your ego, because every good sermon that you preach, there's always a possibility that the next time you stand may not go as well. And, that sermon may have been a feel-good one, but when we're pastoring, as well as every sermon is not there to shout the people out the building. Sometimes there are sermons of correction. There are sermons of whatever. And those are the days the people are not going to come behind you and go, thank you so much. And so we can't let our feelings get put in that place where you have the ebb and flow of how they feel about the sermon. And so it's a very vulnerable place to be as a membership minister if you're not careful.
And I wanted to, because I'm glad you mentioned that, give us insight, because I think sometimes if we're not careful, we put too much of our feelings into it, to where we can, as you say, we can have a great sermon here, and the expectation is, they're going to, blah, blah, this day, every time I preach. But sometimes we do have to be careful of when we put so much of our feelings where we basically like, I'm going to kill him. I'm going to shout him. And then sometimes God kills us before we even get to the pulpit.
Oh gosh. Yeah. So I think for me, you have to put all that stuff in its appropriate place. And so again, I'm just now getting to my second year in pastoring Mount Zion. So this is so different from the number of years I got to sit in the seat next to him and watch him do these things. But what the Lord is teaching me is that every single sermon that he gives me is important, and that it's critical for the life of the church. And what I cannot get involved in is the emotion or the animation of how the people respond to the sermon. All of us are different and unique in our gifts. And so, of course, anybody who knows me knows that I'm not, quote unquote, a hooper or any of those type of things. And so we can get caught up if the people are quiet or if the people are running around the building. Either one of those can influence us in a way that's not healthy. So I had to come to the understanding that if I'm standing and being faithful to what God told me to preach, that I have to trust, as Dr. Clark would always tell us, to let the word do the work. And so I can't judge whether I was successful or not based on the response of the people. My success is, did I study? Did I prepare myself? And did I faithfully preach the message that God gave me? And if I did that, then that was success, whether they shout or not. Very early in my ministry, when I was still at First Baptist, I'll never forget that an older senior pastor was there, Pastor Lemuel, and he used to tell me all the time is that he says maybe the reason why the people are quiet is because they're listening and pondering what you said. That may be the people that are not shouting, that are not doing whatever, but maybe the word that God has given to you is working on them and they're digesting it. So don't let the lack of shouting think that you're a failure or that you've not done it right, but know that people are processing what they hear.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I think that's very important. I think that's very crucial, as you said, that we have to be about making sure that the people are being fed
Yeah.
a full meal, not just bits and pieces, but a full meal.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, as you are, as you say, continuing to have some assignments, continue to grow, how did you find yourself under Dr. Clark at Mount Zion?
Another good question. So when I came to Mount Zion, I had been preaching for, I guess, probably about maybe 8 years or so, 7, 8 years. And so I was there still trying to figure out who I was, my personality, all those kinds of things. And when I came to Mount Zion, I went to Mount Zion understanding that my wife and I were looking for a place where we could be fed, where we could fit into the church and just be a part, not looking to do anything extra or anything like that. And so Dr. Clark was so helpful in his encouragement, in his leading. Dr. Clark would have a class for preachers. I want to say at one time we were doing it twice a month, but for sure at least once a month on a Sunday evening, he would get us together and we would critique the sermons that others of us have preached on that Sunday morning. And so it was during those moments that we learned and we would get to hear his voice and his heart about what preaching is and the fact that no matter how long you've been preaching, you're still learning to preach, you're still doing those things. And it was just something about Mount Zion in the environment that it allowed me to be myself and to not try to be other people. I found out during my time at Mount Zion that it was okay that I have a sense of humor, that there's a part of me that's kind of silly, and that it's okay to be humorous. It's okay to laugh at yourself. It's okay to have a joke as a part of your sermon. And so, whatever it was I was doing at Mount Zion, I learned how to free myself from trying to fit what I thought was what a preacher should look like, is that you have to be this way and speak a certain way and use certain words and you have to be this articulate and you have to be whatever. And I just learned how to relax and to just be me, that I couldn't be anybody else. And so I wish I could put my finger on what it was, but there was just something about being at Mount Zion that allowed me to open up and learn to be who I was.
And because I want to get here,
Yeah.
but for those who don't know, the late Reverend Dr. G.V. Clark was one of God's greatest preachers, pastors, greatest minds.
Oh gosh, yes.
And greatest just people. I recall once again, because that was Uncle LJ, Pastor Mouton's pastor.
Yeah.
And just their relationship, and I watched that relationship. But when Dr. Clark would come to Pleasant Mount Gilead and to hear him preach and just his mind and how it's like this guy was something like amazing, and how he would say even at his elder age he was still reading, still trying to learn, still trying to grow, which is should be encouragement for us that we should never stop trying to grow and learn as preachers, because none of us have arrived. But the way Dr. Clark would preach a sermon was amazing. He preached one sermon, I never forget it, Colossians chapter 1 verse 1-6, and he just preached, do the text. That's one of the sermons I've never forgotten, because it was that powerful, it was that impactful. But the title said it all, do the text. But just the nuggets he had throughout that sermon, it was mind-boggling. So those who may not know, the legacy of Dr. G.V. Clark is one that it was just amazing. So if you would share with us, just about him.
Yeah. So no, Pastor Brown, we could talk about him all day. He was, I mean, we say this all the time, but I literally mean this, is that there will never be another person like him. I think about his heart. I think about his generosity. I think about his love for preachers, is that he was definitely one of those you would call a preacher's preacher. I don't know Dr. Clark to have ever done anything to hurt another preacher. Everything he's ever done has been to help, to encourage us. When I think about and that's kind of what was interesting, is that Dr. Clark and I would definitely have two different preaching styles. Very rarely, if ever, would you hear Pastor Clark in the pulpit say, the first thing I want you to know, the second thing. He would never do that. Dr. Clark he would tell us every Sunday, every time we met, just preach the text and just learn to tell the story, learn how to walk through it. And that's what he did every time he stood, is that whether the story was a narrative, whether it was a psalm, it didn't matter what it was. He would just walk through the text and exegete it one verse at a time. And like you said, he would drop those nuggets and those pearls that would come out of that. And I think all of that came from his study, from his reading. I don't know if a lot of people knew this or not, but his favorite type of books to read were those books that were courtroom dramas. That's what he loved to read. And so he would read those, I think, because of the mystery and how they challenge the mind and how they cause you to think and those type of things. But it was very rare for me to ever see him anywhere without a book in his hand of any kind. And I think being studious like that is who he was. But yeah, a great preacher who, I mean, it's very rare that you find a pastor who can preach a Sunday sermon and just blow your mind. I can't tell you the number of eulogies I've heard him do that just would have you in awe about how he did that and how. But any occasion, it did not matter. He was definitely a preacher extraordinaire, and like I said, there'll never be another one like it. Yeah.
And so when you were serving under Dr. Clark, what
Mm-hmm.
were things that you learned from him
Mm-hmm.
that helped you even before you became the pastor, but
Mm-hmm.
that just helped you in the meantime and then helped you where you are now?
Yeah, yeah. Some of the things I remember most about him is Dr. Clark would privilege me many a times to go to meetings with him that I was not invited to. And
Right.
he would say, come on, go to this meeting with me. And I don't know what it's about. I don't know who's coming. I don't know any of that. I just go with him. And I would sit Pastor Brown and just observe him in these meetings. And in my opinion, there would be some meetings where he was definitely the smartest person in the room, but he was always the last person to talk. I would watch him sit in the meetings and just listen to everything that is being said. And sometimes the person hosting the meeting would literally have to say, Dr. Clark, we've not heard anything from you. Is there something you'd like to say? And by the time he finished speaking, the room was never the same. And so I learned from him about listening and sitting in the room and trying to get an understanding of what's going on before you speak, because I thought that was wisdom and how he did those things. I watched how he conducted church meetings and how he conducted them with a sense of authority, but also with a sense of grace. He did it into the fashion that this is what's going on at the church. This is the information we want everybody to have. This is what God is doing in our church. And this is the direction that God is leading us. And he did it because of how the Lord had convicted him and convinced him. And when you listen to him, you couldn't help but be convinced that he was convinced that this is what we're supposed to do. And so just watching the way he stood, just his very presence was how he captured a room when he walked in. And so just watching all of those little things, the way he did it, we'll never try to dress like him. We'll never try to walk like him physically, but it's just the image, the character, all of those things that he did. I tried to observe and watch those things so that even before I became the pastor, if I was ever representing Mount Zion somewhere, I wanted to do it with that same level of excellence. And all of those things have definitely paid off, I think, to this point.
And so while you were at Mount Zion, were you preaching a lot?
So probably I would probably say easily the last 8 years or so, I came into a place at Mount Zion when I became his assistant to the pastor. And so it would be normal that anytime Mount Zion did not see him, they would see me. And so I think that's part of what made the transition a little more comfortable, is that the church had had years of seeing me either standing next to him or standing in his place. But when I first came to Mount Zion, I don't know how long it took before I ever had a chance to preach, especially on a Sunday. I think it took several years before I had the opportunity, but it was fine for me because I came just to be a member. I wasn't coming looking to do anything other than that. And so, but yeah, definitely the last 7, 8 years or so before he retired, the church heard from me a lot more often.
And I think that's important what you have indicated, how you weren't looking to preach the sense of having your own security to
Mhm.
where you know what you're called to do, to where you know what you are led to do, and that you just waited your turn. So what would you tell preachers about waiting your turn? Because let's just be real,
Yeah, yeah,
it's hard sometimes as a young preacher.
yeah,
I'm guilty. Sometimes, especially
yeah,
especially when you even see your peers where they're like they're getting called to this church, getting called to this church. Sometimes getting called to big,
oh yeah,
big churches, or they're going all across the country on the circuit and stuff.
yeah.
But you may just feel like you're in a cocoon or just a
Mhm.
holding pattern. But as you say, be faithful. But even in the midst of that, that doesn't mean that your human side does not show up. Sometime and you're wondering, I study, I work hard too. Why? But it's like, what would you say to any preacher, pastor, about just waiting your turn?
Yeah, I like that. So I think part of what helped me is, again, when I left from First Baptist, I heard very clearly that the Lord was telling me it was time to move. Now, God did not tell me necessarily where to go, but He told us it was time to move. And so, again, because of a distant relationship I had, Pastor Clark had been our moderator for 40 years. And so I remember him when I was a teenager and, that kind of stuff. So I knew of him, but we didn't have a relationship. And so, anyway, the short of the story is when I came to Mount Zion, I had this level of respect for him because of how I had seen him from a distance. And so, again, my mindset was I'm going to this larger church of Mount Zion where he's already got 18 preachers on his preaching role. I'm coming over here just to help and just to sit down and to learn and do whatever. So for me, it was easy to find my place in the back. He had plenty of preachers who could preach and who could do the stuff he needed them to do. And so, what I would tell people about waiting their turn or tell preachers about that is, number one, figure out what God would have you to do in your current assignment. I think what helped me to be comfortable is that eventually, after I'd been there for several years, Pastor Clark asked me would I be interested in serving as the youth pastor of the church. And so when the Lord allowed me to accept that, I had plenty to do. So I wasn't worried about trying to preach on Sunday because I was worried about the kids and trying to go to games and try to minister to families. So I had plenty to do that I didn't even need to worry about Sunday mornings or anything like that. And so I think that begins to occupy our mind when you're not serving where God would have you to do at the moment. And so if you're just sitting around waiting to preach, then that's going to start eating you up from the inside. So I think part of that is what kept me busy and gave me plenty of other things to do. I think also as young preachers, I would tell us to look within ourselves and ask the question, if possibly God is not using you as you want him to, because we're not preparing ourselves as we should.
Mm.
Because again, I, there's a pastor here in town, and I hope I'm giving the pastor the right credit. I think it's Dr. B.W. McClendon at St. James.
Oh, legend.
He tells the preachers at his church that before you ever even get a chance to be called to be a pastor, he encourages them that you ought to be writing a sermon every Sunday as if you are the pastor.
Yes, sir.
And he tells them to do that so that you get into the habit and the routine of what it's like to prepare a sermon every Sunday. Now, I wish I could tell you how many of them heed that advice. I have no idea. But I heard that third hand and thought that was some of the best advice I had ever been given. And now that I'm sitting in that chair, I wish I would have heard that a long time ago to be able to do that. So I would encourage young preachers to get into the practice of preparing as if you are preaching every Sunday, and just begin to pile those sermons up and put them in put them in your cabinet or whatever you do with them, so that you have them, so that God can draw from them. And so find out what has you doing at that place, because there's a place for you to serve wherever you are. Again, don't underestimate the prison ministry, the seniors ministry, if there's a nursing home, the youth ministry. They usually always need help with doing things. Sunday school and training union, any of those opportunities that you get to teach and to use your gift, I would try to use as many of those as you can, and that kind of helps you from falling into that other pit of that dangerous place you can be.
So, do you think, just from looking at from your vantage point, do you think that sometimes us as young preachers, young pastors, we hurt ourselves because we want to get too much too soon?
Sure, absolutely, Absolutely. There are, like you mentioned earlier, I think all of us have had friends and colleagues who been preaching for 1 or 2 years. We think we got it down and we think we're ready for a church. And so you begin submitting resumes to every church that is open, trying to find something in everything you want to do. And my personal belief is if God has a church for you, God also knows when you're ready. And that was part of the patience for me is, again, I can't tell you the number of people that I had to tell this to in the years I was at Mount Zion is that I'm here with no motive and no agenda. God told us to come here and I'm here to serve however I can serve, because people begin to place their own narratives over what you're doing. I actually, it's, I would have people say, I can't believe you're over there just waiting on him to retire. You really think Mount Zion's going to call you after he retires? You waiting on him to die. People would say crazy stuff like that. And my honest and sincere motive was the Lord told us to come here to serve. And I have no other motive other than that. And so when the journey began to take that turn and Pastor Clark and I began to have those conversations, it caught me off guard at first, but God was able to walk me through that to say, this is what I brought you here. And once I was able to accept that later on, it was a totally different approach to that.
So then let's talk about, the succession, about how, as you say, Dr. Clark started having those conversations with you, and then when it actually happened, just walk us through that, if you don't mind. Walk us through that, because I believe, we live in a time now to where, as the church continues to grow forward, I believe succession is biblical.
Absolutely.
But I also believe that as we continue to grow forward, I think that the church of today has to be prepared for succession as well. So walk us through your experience with that succession.
Yeah, absolutely. So part of what Dr. Clark did for me, which I didn't truly understand at the time, is that Dr. Clark was very much an advocate for education, as you have mentioned before. And so I think when I came to Mount Zion, I definitely had my bachelor's degree at the time. And so he was part of the encouragement that says, I think you ought to go to school and do some things, some other stuff. So I'd started doing some graduate school work at the time. And so I can remember the point when I finished working on the master's degree, and then something popped up or somebody came and said, hey, man, you ought to consider going to the Presbyterian seminary, and there's some opportunities there. And I was like, no, man, I've done enough school. School ain't my thing. So I got convinced to go and do that, and it was an amazing opportunity. And so I went and got another master's degree, the Master of Divinity from the Presbyterian School. And then I was done, Pastor Brown. That was it. This was enough school for me. And Dr. Clark was like, no, you're not done. You need to go do something else. You need to do something else. And so he, and along with God leading my counselor, and that's when I went on to apply for the Doctor of Ministry, which I didn't think I had a chance to get in. But once I did that, so it was during the time when I was beginning school for that Dr. Clark and I began to have some really serious conversations. And he said, I really believe that you're the person that God sent to succeed me. And as you can imagine, having him tell me that was just a shock to my heart and just overwhelming, that I was like, I don't know who wants to follow you. This is crazy. There's no way to want to do that. And so just little bit by little bit, he and I would have these conversations about what the Lord was sharing with him. And so we finally got to the place where he said, Daryl, I really believe that you're the one, and I think that God is going to show that to you. And he says, but what I'm asking God for is that the Lord will leave me here long enough that you'll finish school. Because I don't want you trying to pastor a church, finish your degree, and doing all that other stuff. But I'm asking the Lord to leave me here long enough for you to finish your degree. And so as I'm working on that degree, he and I are talking, and we're trying to put stuff in place at the church. And so I remember the day I called him and I said, Pastor, what you doing? He said, not much. I said, well, I got good news for you. He said, well, what is that? And I said, well, I just defended my dissertation, defended my project. And so I'm actually going to graduate in August. And the phone was kind of quiet. And so he said, okay, well, let's figure out what we're going to do. And so lo and behold, what was crazy about it is that that's when COVID hit. And so we're celebrating his 50th year of ministry at Mount Zion. I mean, we're literally, Pastor Brown, about to do his anniversary, and COVID shuts the world down that March. And so he and I have been talking about transition and what does it look like. And so we both said, man, we trying to figure out how church works in COVID. So we can't do no transition right now. But as 2020 went on, he and I got to the place where he said, I don't think this is going anywhere. So we need to go ahead and work on doing this now. And so I love what he did, is the fact that he said, I'm not going to put you in a place. The church has to call you. Because if the church doesn't call you, then it's not the church's responsibility. The church does not have accountability. And I said, okay, whatever that means, let's work through that. And so what he did is that he literally went to the church that January when we had our meeting and announced to the church that he was retiring, that it was time. And he told the church that he believed in his heart that I was the person God sent to succeed him, but the church needed to call me. So they set up a pastoral pulpit committee. I had to submit my resume, my CV. I had to be interviewed. I went through all of that as if I was brand new. And then the church went through a time of making sure they prayed about it. And so several months later, we had a special called meeting. The church came back and declared what their vote was and that the church was in the affirmative of what Pastor Clark had recommended. So I don't think, and I think he would agree if he were still here, that the process may not have been perfect. But I do believe that the process was transparent. I believe that it was God-led. And it began with he and I having conversations 6-7 years before it all took place, with him telling me, I believe this is what God wants to do. Do you hear the same? And so with the two of us being able to walk through that and talk about what it looks like and what it means. And I tell people to this day, I could not have had a better predecessor than Dr. G.B. Clark. Pastor Clark told me over and over again, when the Lord allows this, I'm going to be your best member. And that's hilarious to hear Pastor Clark say that to somebody. But Pastor Brown, he literally did that. Dr. Clark, we did all of that. The church held the meeting. And then June of 21 was my first Sunday as the pastor of the church. And from that moment, Dr. Clark came to church and sat in the back. During the week, he didn't come to the office. He would come in every now and then to check on me. He didn't come to meetings. He didn't do these other things. I mean, he lived up to the word that he gave. And then he was there for me to talk to him, to ask him questions, to be supportive. And anytime he stood up anywhere, he would stand before people and say, I'm a member of the Mount Zion Church, and that's my pastor. And he did that intentionally in front of the people so that the people would know where he stood. And I believe that that cuts out on a lot of stuff in the midst of transition, that people are saying, did you hear what he did? Did you hear what he said? Well, would you have done that? And to my knowledge, I mean, if those things happened, he never shared them with me. But he did tell me that if anybody came to me asking about pastoring of the church, I'm sending them to you.
Yes, sir.
So I appreciate him, and I will forever, for the way he handled it and the way he demonstrated that in front of the people.
I think that's a blessing, because I think, with succession, as you say, it is important to understand, once the succession is in place, and I love senior pastors that I've seen who have given their succession and said, no, that's the guy. Y'all don't come to me, you come to this person. But from your experience, what would you tell a senior pastor who may be looking to succession, or even a church who maybe that hasn't really walked through succession? What would be some key tools that you would give them to understand the importance of succession?
Yeah, excellent. I guess the place I would start is where you started, and that is that pastoral succession, or succession period, is biblical. And again, we could run through all that today, looking at Paul and Timothy, looking at Moses and Joshua. I mean, you could, Elijah and Elisha. We could do all of that and talk about how the Lord shows that it is in his program and in his method to always have somebody ready to succeed. The second thing that I would say is that Dr. Clark one day shared with me, and it blew my mind. He told me that when he first was called to Mount Zion as the pastor, he said the one prayer he prayed is that God would allow him to meet his successor. Whether I'm at the church for 5 years or 70 years, he said that he prayed every year that the Lord would allow him to meet his successor. And that's what I would encourage senior pastors to know, is that, again, we all know that tomorrow is not promised to us. And whether God has blessed you with 5 years or 25 years, we don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. And so I would encourage all senior pastors to always be praying for who the person is God wants to succeed them, because I think that opens the door for God to move them in that direction, to pray and ask God to send them that person. And then senior pastors also have to be confident enough in themselves that whoever God sends is going to be different. They are going to have strengths that you don't have. They're going to have weaknesses that you don't have. And you have to be confident enough in yourself to allow that person to have space. Again, Dr. Clark and I are not two different ends of the spectrum, but we're different people. And I can guarantee you that he was never intimidated by me. I can promise you that. And I think that's what causes the conflict sometimes, is that a senior pastor also has to be prayed up that whoever this younger person is, that they may better relate to young people. They may be a better preacher. They may have more degrees. I mean, who knows what it might be, but you cannot allow the enemy to seep in and allow there to be a factor of intimidation, because you begin to act out of character and you begin to harm the church by trying to make things difficult for them. For the churches, I would quickly say churches should always be prayerful. You love your pastor. You're not waiting for your pastor to leave. But for the continuity of ministry, you should always be praying that God will give wisdom to the pastor, to the leadership of the church, to be looking for who's going to be next. And Pastor, that's what I'm trying to do here at Mount Zion, is not just for my, because I tell people, and it makes them a little bit nervous, as I tell them, I said, as early as my pastorate is, I've already started praying and asking God to show who my successor is going to be, because I don't know how long this is going to be. And then I do the same thing with our ministry leaders. And so I'm pushing all of our ministry leaders to pray and to look among themselves. Who are you training to replace you, so that ministry does not stop? And so it has to become a mindset. It has to become a culture that succession is not a bad thing and that it is what God wants.
And I love that you said it, because I have conversations that with something like a few of my best friends. We always talk about that, is that we don't just pastor for us.
Right.
We pastor for the next person.
Yes.
Because one day somebody's going to follow after you.
Yes.
And what you do,
yes,
whatever you do,
Mhm.
it's gonna have a good effect, or it's gonna have a bad effect. But that next guy is going to inherit whatever you do.
That's right.
So it's important for you to, as you say, make sure you're doing things that to where when the next guy comes, he won't have the same battles, or he won't have this, and he won't have that. Whoever that person is, they can press the envelope forward.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, you want to try to set the stage for whoever that individual is going to be. And I think we hear people say this all the time, but for me, I want to make sure that I leave Mount Zion better than it was when I inherited it. And that doesn't mean that it was bad, because I know the shoulders that I'm standing on. And so I want to take it and hope that the person can stand on my shoulders and take it even further. And so I want to do everything I can to put Mount Zion in a place where God would have it. And what better way to do that than to trust God, because God knows.
And I like that. So, and also, because I believe you definitely can help all of us with this as well, is following a legend.
Sure.
Because there have been great preachers who have followed legends. I don't have the book, but I think about Dr. Robert Smith following C.L. Franklin.
Sure.
You think about some great men, Dr. Raphael Warnock at Ebenezer. I mean, you're following the King legacy, basically. So when we talk about following a legend, and like I said, Dr. Clark was a local legend, national, state legend, but now you have stepped in and you're doing a phenomenal job already. But following a legend, how do you go about not just following a legend, but being secure within yourself?
Yeah. Fantastic question. So once I got to the place where I overcame the initial shock that he and I were really having these conversations, the Lord had to get me to a place where he says, I've called you for this. I've equipped you for this. So now you need to unapologetically walk in it. And that's really been the thing that has helped me to move forward, is that I know in my mind that I don't deserve it. I know that I've done nothing to warrant pastoring the Mount Zion Church. I know that I don't deserve to be in the place to reap the benefits of everything that Dr. Clark has put in place. But I've also learned that I don't have to apologize, because God did it.
Yes, sir.
Now, it'd be different if you do something to sneak and to do whatever to get into a place, then you have to look behind your back. But if God does it, that's the message that he has given to me is I want you to unapologetically walk in where I've placed you. And so when you think about walking behind someone like that, what I try to do is I want to do everything I can to honor his legacy. I try to think about what he put in place. I try to think about the conversations that he and I had. I try to think about the conversations we had about the vision that he had for Mount Zion. And Pastor Brown, some of the coolest days I've ever had with him is I can remember sitting at the church and he would be there and he would just walk outside and stand in front of Mount Zion and just look. And he would almost just be staring and, from left to right. And he would just stand there for moments. And one day I went outside and just stood next to him and I said, maybe I'm missing something. I want to look and see what he's looking at. And those are moments where he would share with me and say, this is what God has allowed me to do. And he would share with me that when he came to the church, the Lord told him, I'm going to allow you to increase what Mount Zion has. And he looks around to see what came in fruition. He also would look at me and say that I know that God wants us to do X, Y, and Z. And I thank God that he was able to see the beginning of that before the Lord called him home. And so I try to remember those things and say, what is it that he wanted to accomplish? What did he accomplish? And then what can I do to walk and to build on top of that? The other thing I have to constantly not remind me, but remind other people is that I am not him.
Yes, sir.
I'm not going to preach like him. I don't 100% think like him. I'm not going to operate like him. And so who you have is me. And so I have to make sure that I'm comfortable in my own skin because the people can notice if I'm trying to be him. And so thankfully, during the time that I was walking with him, I learned how to walk behind him. I learned how to walk beside him, but I walked at my own pace. I walked at my own stride. I'll never forget, Pastor Brown, that after Pastor Parker in Dallas succeeded the great CBT Smith.
Yes.
One day they asked him to talk about succession at our state convention, and it was hilarious to me because he says, people keep asking me about walking in CBT Smith's shoes. And he says, my feet are much bigger than he is, so I can't walk in his shoes. And so I think about stuff like that makes you laugh. But I understand what he's saying is that I have to be me, and I honor his legacy. I stand on his shoulders, and I recognize that. But I think it's a lot of prayer and helping God to strengthen my own self-confidence to know that if he called me to be here, this is my moment to be here to do what he's called me to do and to use the gifts that maybe my predecessor did not have, because there was a time for his gifts and there's a time for mine.
I like how you said that. I go back to one of my favorite pastors is Reverend Dr. Timothy Fleming from Mount Carmel in Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
And his late son, Reverend Art Fleming, one of my favorite preachers, one of the greatest preachers, unfortunately was tragically killed in a car accident at 22. But Pastor Fleming at his preacher's son's funeral, and he said this to the church. He said that his son had told the church, this was in 93, his son had told the church, because he said that they were trying to compare him and his dad, but he said, I'm not better than my father. I'm just more equipped for my generation. Because Art Fleming was more about, with the Greek and really breaking scripture down. And Pastor Fleming was more kind of the old school traditional preacher at the time. But he said, I'm more equipped for my generation. I think that's what you hit on as well. And I think when we talk about succession, that does come into play, is that it's not, I'm standing on this legend's shoulders,
yes.
But now what generation I am in is not going to be the same. So God calls each pastor for that specific generation. Because even as we look at in biblical times, when Moses served his generation, Joshua served his generation, David served his generation.
Yeah. And you have to be able to see that. And if I'm so busy worried about trying to be G.V. Clark, then I'll miss out on how God uniquely made me and the opportunities that he provided for me. And again, I think it even goes, Pastor Brown, beyond what you do within the four walls. I think where God strategically places you in the city where you are. And even in those dynamics, I think all of that makes a difference, that God sets and establishes those things. And so you have to be able to walk into who you are, regardless of how different you are from your predecessor. Yeah.
And so now, as you are the pastor going on, you said 2 years at Mount Zion.
Yes, sir. In
So
June.
how has that been for you?
It's been, I can honestly say it has been a joy. And I know that some people say, man, you honeymoon and you don't know what's going on. But again, I have to remind people that I've been at Mount Zion for over 20 years at this point. And so I think that there's a sense of family, there's a sense of love and respect that the members have for me and I have for them that help to make the transition very easy. But I am again learning, as some preachers will say, is that there's a huge difference between that seat and the middle chair.
Yes.
And so the responsibility and knowing the fact that when issues arise, I can't turn and call him, I can't defer to him. So I'm learning how to adapt to those things. Again, I laugh and joke with other pastors and say, man, y'all didn't tell me that there's only 4 days between Sundays. I thought there were seven. And so, and so learning how to get accustomed to that and making those adjustments. But the Mount Zion Church, if I can brag on them, they have made this transition in these first 2 years just unbelievable. We have our challenges that we come up with. We have the things that we must encounter. But Mount Zion is such an amazing church that we have handled everything up to this point with love and with respect and with all of that. And they have just loved and embraced me in a fashion that is overwhelming. So it's been good, but I'm learning a lot every day.
And well, that's a blessing. And I like, because I wanted to go to this with preaching, because like I said, I've listened to you preach, and you are a phenomenal preacher. Especially in one sermon you definitely preached. Actually, Dr. Clark, one of Dr. Clark's memorial services, and you talked about Elisha and Elijah. And I mean, you blew up the internet that night with that sermon. But your style of preaching, because as you say, you're not a traditional hooper, but which I think in the time we're living, hooping is still great. All of us love to do it, but we also have to make sure that our sermon content is there for this generation of people, because they listen, they research, and all these things. So what is your process of preaching, and who are the voices even now that you listen to that inspire you?
Oh, wow. So what I try to do is, which has been interesting, because again, as a membership minister, again, I would preach occasionally when Dr. Clark was out of town, or if it was whatever the case was. And so, I'd have a little bit of notice, and, these one-off sermons, it's, whatever the Lord leads you and whatever God does, that usually works out. But now in pastoring, as you know, your sermons are intended to feed the people, because you're supposed to know their spiritual condition and where the Lord wants you to lead them. And so the sermons are not just random things that pop up on Sunday. You're going somewhere. You're trying to get to some place. And so I've learned to spend a lot more time asking God about direction, and is this the place where we're going? What is it the people need to hear? And how do you want me to shape the people and move them? And so that's what helps to form and develop the sermons. I don't think my sermon preparation, other than that mindset, has really changed from what I was doing before. And that is, I always pray this prayer that says, Lord, you know who's going to be sitting in the seats, so you tell me what they need to hear. And it's from that time of prayer that the Lord begins to show me things and lead me to passages of scripture. And Pastor Brown, I can't sing a lick, but I do love music. I grew up. My high school years and stuff were in the early 90s. And so I love hip hop. I love R&B, that kind of stuff. And so a lot of those things are the things that run through my mind about, hey, that might make a good sermon. I got to clean up the song, but that might
absolutely.
And so I learned, I may be giving him too much credit, but I know that Dr. Delvin Atchison, one time, I could have sworn that he was the one that said, every time I leave the house, I'm listening for a sermon, because God speaks to us in our everyday stuff. You're walking through the grocery store and there's an encounter, and the Lord can speak a sermon from that. I'm sitting at the car wash, or I'm sitting at a baseball game. And so I've tried to learn to have my mind and my ears to be open, that even in a conversation with somebody that could be about something totally different, a sermon can pop out of that conversation. And so those are some of the things that I try to do. To be very honest, I try now or at least it's always been my practice. I don't do a lot of YouTube and a lot of listening and a lot of that other kind of stuff because I want to make sure that I know that I can learn from people, but I don't want to listen to people so much that I begin to mimic them. And so what I love to do is to hear people in person because I can watch mannerisms. I can, look at some of those things and I can listen to how they break down a text or how they. Now, I will tell you that one preacher I do love to listen to, Pastor John Adolph out of
Yes,
Bowman,
sir.
a storyteller.
Oh, yes.
Oh, I love the way he tells stories and how those stories interact with the sermon. And so I've always been appreciative of wanting to become a storyteller and how you're able to do those kind of things. And so I do the best I can to read a lot. And so I try to read so that those things can happen. But yes, sermon preparation, it tries to be organic, but just try to be disciplined in what you do and hear what's needed for the moment. Yeah.
Yes, sir. And so when you think about preaching of today,
Mhm.
what encourages you and what might discourage you from preaching that you hear?
Gotcha. Um, I guess what I'll say is that, and discouraging, I guess I'll use that word, is that I still think, and this is not anything new, is that we as preachers have to be careful that preaching is not entertainment. I do think that social media and all those other things have encouraged that 9 times out of 10, when I see a sermon online, I don't get to see the meat online because all we record is the close.
Hmm.
And so, what's discouraging to me is that we have a generation, if not two, of younger preachers who are coming up, and that's what they focus on is the close, and that they spend more time on the close than the content. And so, it would be my prayer that we as preachers would get to the place where the content is always more important than the close. Dr. Clark would always tell us that old saying that a good steak makes its own gravy. And so you don't have to try to manufacture that or do any of that. So if you take care of the content, the Lord will help you with the close. And so that's what I would say as far as discouragement is just making sure that it's not entertainment, that I'm not trying to close like somebody else. And then I think there's a danger in us developing and growing and training the people that they don't pay attention to any of the sermon until they hear your voice change. And that's when they pay attention to the sermon. So I think that's a danger we might have. What encourages me about preaching is that I still see lives being changed by preaching. I still see preachers who are younger than me, who are dynamic, who are magnificent, who are awesome, who are incredible, who are changing the lives of people because of the gift that God has given them. And so it helps me to know that God's word is true, is that preaching will never become extinct, that there's always a place for it. And I'm excited when I see preachers who are younger than myself who are coming up and who are blowing the doors off of places. Because again, they're getting the training, they're learning from the older statesmen, they're getting the education, they're doing all the things they need to be good homileticians, to be good preachers, to be good exegetors of the text. And so that's what excites me about preaching is that it's still relevant and that God told us that that's what he would always use and it still works.
And then what about, as you talk about education,
Yeah.
because I think I believe all of us that share the word of God,
Hmm.
proclaim the word of God, need some form of theological education. I
Sure.
remember when I first started, I didn't think that highly. I was like, a lot of young preachers have had that thought where it basically was just like, I can do this, be like this person. They didn't have a seminary degree. They didn't have a seminary degree.
Yeah.
But when you go to seminary,
Hmm.
and when you get the theological foundation and education, it does do something different for you to
Hmm.
where it opens your mind, but it grows you first as a Christian. Then
Sure.
it grows you as a preacher even more. So what would you say are keys to theological education, and what would you tell a young preacher about going to school?
I think some of the keys to theological education is know that it's not a magic pill or it's not a magic bullet.
Hmm.
Is that if you're not disciplined, if you don't study, if you don't listen to God, going to seminary is not going to make a difference. And so you have to still have those personal priorities in doing what you have to do with the Word of God. I would also caution us that in the age in which we live right now, you need to be very selective in the school that you decide to attend. No knock, and I won't name any names of anything in particular, but there's almost a school now on every corner. You can get on the internet and earn a degree in 7 months. And walking around and folks calling you doctor and all this other stuff because of this online degree that you have. I tell people that if you decide to go to school, I think it's important enough that wherever you decide to go, you should not be ashamed to tell people about the piece of paper that's on your wall. And so do the research, make sure that it's an accredited school, make sure that they're teaching what you believe, because there are a number of seminaries now, in my humble opinion, that are teaching a lot of things that may not necessarily be biblical, and they're believing a lot of things. And so you can go to these schools and be trained and get all the degrees that you want, but they are straying away from what we believe to be the core content of the Bible. So you have to be careful, and don't go to school just to get the initials behind your name, because that doesn't make any difference. You can have people call you doctor all day and your ministry never be effective, because you're just an educated fool at that point, because it didn't do anything for you. Now, on the flip side of that, I agree with you 100%. Going to seminary did help me, because there are things I've read in my time in seminary that I never would have read on my own, never
Yes.
would have found it, never would have known it existed, never would have thought about it. And so it does enlarge your thinking, and the way you think and the things that you think about is what I think seminary does for us. But seminary is not perfect. There are a lot of things that you walk out of seminary and you come back and go, man, I wish the school would have taught me that. Man.
Listen, man. Oh my, listen. Well, when you start pastoring, you really say, like, man, where was this class? Where was this class?
Hey, man, yeah, where was all of this? And how they didn't teach us about when people fight, or when, all that stuff. But I think some seminaries are paying attention. I can remember when I was at school at the Presbyterian seminary, they started talking about how many pastors go to these churches and have absolutely zero financial education.
Mhm.
So they go to these churches and they're responsible for budgets. They're responsible for all this other stuff and have no clue how to do those kind of things. So they begin to adapt the seminary education to help you get financial training and to understand some things like that. But most of your seminary education is not, unfortunately, going to help you with the day-to-day stuff. They are going to teach you about church history. They are going to teach you about how to take a text and how to break it apart and how to do the Greek and the Hebrew. They're going to teach you all that kind of stuff. But again, it is not a magic bullet to make you a master pastor by the time you walk out the door. It still is going to take God walking with you and you spending time with him to be an effective pastor, in my opinion.
No, I appreciate that. I think you hit that on the nose. But yeah, I wish that seminary, when I went, they had more classes, because I mean, and I think as we look at the church now, there are a whole lot of things that we do need. Of course, we need preaching, teaching. Of course, we need to know about theology, apologetics, but also we need to have more classes talking about leadership, talking about leading this next generation. I'm talking about mental health, because mental health is so practical and important. As you talk about having life insurance, having IRA, having a good retirement plan, so that when you die, your family doesn't need to take up an offering just to bury you. We need to have these conversations. Of course, we talk about pulpit etiquette, we talk about books, but it's so many other things, because my goal is to go back to Anderson to get my last degree and my doctorate in leadership from a Christian ministry perspective, because I believe that as we continue to go forward, I'm always thinking, what's next? And I think as pastors now, we have to always think about what's next. Like, okay, we made this goal, and that's great, and we should celebrate. But now, okay, what's next?
Absolutely, yeah. And again, Dr. Clark was so critical in reminding us that ministry and preaching is all about preparation.
Yes, sir.
And so that's why he was pushing me beyond my comfort zone, telling me, go back to school and get this and get this and get this. And again, not just for that preparation part, but again, because of the culture in which we live, there are some doors that can be opened by education. There are some some opportunities that may never be offered to you if you don't have certain credentials and things like that. But that's a whole nother conversation. But I think that it is helpful. I do encourage every preacher I know, if they can, if it's available, to try to get some sense of formal education, even if it's a certificate, even if it's something specialized that will help you in your ministry, because it is much needed as you talk about mental health, leadership, finances. social work, all of those things that the church, especially the Black church, is called to do. It's helpful for the administration
Yes.
to do that kind of stuff. So so school and formal education does definitely help.
Absolutely. So I appreciate you for that as well. As we get ready to close this, because I've held you, I thank you for your time today. Because you didn't have to do this, but I thank you for your time today. But as we get ready to close on today, just thinking about as we've had this conversation, just what is on your heart specifically?
Oh, very good question. So for me right now, what's on my heart is how do we continue to activate the local church to do ministry in our community?
Yes, sir.
As pastors, we have to be focused on what happens inside the walls, but I am convinced that God calls us as pastors to a greater level of service and leadership. And so, therefore, I think we ought to be active in our community. We ought to be active in our city. We ought to be knowledgeable about what's going on. I think that the Black preacher is still called to be a voice, a prophetic voice in our city when it comes to all the challenges that are going on. I think part of this might just be because we're in the city of Austin and a lot of stuff is happening here at the Capitol and those type of things. But I think we ought to be engaged. We ought to be cognizant of the things that are taking place, and so that we can be a better servant for not just our church members, but also for our community. So that's kind of what's on my heart and mind these days is how can the church better serve the community, be more visible. And then also, I'm so blessed to have a group of pastors in the city that are focusing on discipleship. It is weird to think that in so many churches the word discipleship is missing.
Yes.
We hear good sermons, we have a shouting good time, but how many of your members actually know when they leave the building how to win somebody to Christ, how to have a conversation about
Yes.
Jesus? How many of them know that when Jesus calls us to be disciples, the number one thing he asks us to do is to be a disciple and to make more disciples? And if we're not doing that, we're missing the point. And so those are just kind of two big things that are on my heart is the community and how we serve and the church being a church of discipleship.
I love that about discipleship because I think that is so key
Yeah.
because Jesus commands us to do that. And it just seems like, you have it just seems like there are a lot who are just comfortable
Yeah.
with this, with where we are, with the status quo, but not trying to make disciples, not trying to bring new converts. And now we see now with the way God has navigated the church, we are a multi-dimensional church. We are a virtual church. We are in-person church. We're both of these things. So there's so many tools that God gives us to use. But as you say, it's on us to have the spirit and the heart to be versatile in all these situations.
Yeah. And Pastor, real quick, the truth of the matter is if we're not discipling people, your local church almost has a death sentence.
Yes, sir.
Because it is very true. Jesus did say that the gates of hell shall not prevail and his church shall live be up forever. But that doesn't mean your local church can't shut down because you're not reproducing disciples. And again, another whole long conversation. It's one thing for us to swap members throughout the city, but that's not growth. We have to get the ones that are unsaved. We have to find the people that don't know Jesus and bring them in so that the church grows and continues. Because if you're content with that, one day you're going to look around and you will have buried everybody. And what do you do with the church now? So discipleship has to be important.
My.
Yeah.
I think you just helped a whole lot of people with that.
Oh my goodness.
I'm just saying that's a word. That's a word right there, is that we have to be about we have to be about sharing the word and getting out of our comfort zones.
That's it.
Getting out of the comfort zones, because I teach our church. I've been telling our churches that there are people not just in Winchester, there are people in Lexington and Paris and Georgetown, all across here, who need the gospel as well. That God doesn't call us just to be a one location church. We should go all into all the world because that's our charge.
That's right. And if we're not sharing the gospel and bringing the lost to Christ, then we're missing the first primary thing he's asked us to do. And so that's the challenge.
My goodness. Well, listen, I've held Dr. Horton long enough today. I appreciate him for this time. I pray that you all have been blessed today. But before I close, Dr. Horton, tell them about Mount Zion. If they're ever in Austin in the ATX and 512, let them know.
Yes, thank you so much, Pastor Brown. Thank you for this privilege, man. This has been a joy and a pleasure. And I just thank you so much for this opportunity. So Mount Zion is located in historic East Austin. We are there, 2938 East 13th Street. Actually, this year, Pastor, we are celebrating 150 years that the Lord
Yes, sir.
has Mount Zion to be in ministry. And so, if you're in the city of Austin, we'd love to have you come on the east side and come and check us out. Worship service is at 10:30 every Sunday, and we do have a good time. I don't know how the Lord does it, but the Lord has blessed Mount Zion for generations to have an amazing worship and arts ministry, and we still have that today. And it is my prayer that you come and be blessed by the word as well. So we'd love to have you come anytime you're in the city.
Absolutely. Well, I'm gonna ask Pastor to stay on just for a quick minute after we get off here. But listen, God bless you all. God keep you all as well. You can look up Mount Zion. They're on Facebook. They have a website, so you can look them up. And they've done some great renovations as well. So they're doing a whole lot. But what a fantastic church. So once again, God bless you and God keep you is our prayer. Everyone have a great afternoon.